For today, let's look at the discourse marker vehaya, indirect speech, and et. Let's begin first by looking at subject co-referential pronouns. Wait, what is this? Well, we have something like this in English, at least in some southern dialects of English, like in I just love me some sweet tea, where me is co-referential with the subject I. And it doesn't really seem to be accomplishing anything in the sentence. Like, you could just take it out and it would mean the exact same thing. I just love some sweet tea, right? So what is it doing? Well, before we answer that question, particularly about Hebrew, let's look at some other interesting facts about the syntax of this construction. For instance, B shows that you can't move that subject co-referential pronoun. It must remain adjacent to the verb. So you can't say, me, I just love some sweet tea. C shows that you can't coordinate these pronouns. You can't say, Marissa and I just love me and her some sweet tea. Although you could say, Marissa and I just love ourselves some sweet tea. D shows that you can't replace the pronoun in this construction with a regular noun. So you can't say, Marissa just loves Marissa some sweet tea. And E shows that you can't target the content of that pronoun with a question. So you can't say something like, for whom does Marissa just love some sweet tea? So those are some peculiarities in the syntax of this construction, and they likely apply to Hebrew as well. Here's an example from the Hebrew Bible. God comes to Abraham and says, Lech lecha me'artzecha. So a command, you walk to you from your land, where here is our subject co-referential pronoun, and in Hebrew, it always attaches to preposition la. And like in English, you could just get rid of it completely, and it would seem to mean the exact same thing. Lech me'artzecha means walk from your land. So the question which you've been asking is why? Why would an author use this construction? And unfortunately, it's hard to know exactly why. It may be something like a subject intensifier, or how I would prefer to put it, a marker of contrastive subject focus. So God coming to Abraham and saying, you, as opposed to anybody else I could have approached, you get going from your land. But again, it's hard to know exactly what the pragmatic effect of this construction is supposed to be, because this construction is actually quite rare in the Hebrew Bible. And next, vehaya as a discourse marker. This is another point that will strike you as strange, being an English speaker, but this is why you put in all the hard work of learning Hebrew, so that you can be looking at what the language is doing on its own terms, rather than reading an English translation. Now, vehaya as discourse marker, as opposed to a regular verb. But I guess first, what kind of verbal form is vehaya? It is a third-person masculine singular vekatal form of haya yihyeh, and then vayehi is the vayikdol form of haya yihyeh. And both vehaya and vayehi can be discourse markers here. Okay, first point, that discourse marker as opposed to a regular verb. A regular verb where it has to agree with a subject in person, gender, and number. And we've seen several of these instances in the stories that we've learned so far. For instance, in the Micah story, Vayehi ish ushmo Michaihu, and there was a man, and his name was Micah, where here this verb is third person masculine singular because the subject is masculine singular. And this really is the same kind of construction and content as well. Another instance is in the Abram and the heir story. Vayhi Avraham ben tish'im shana v'tesha shanim. And Abraham was a son of 90 year and 9 years means, and Abraham was 99 years old, where this is third person masculine singular, particularly because this is a masculine singular subject. And so regular verb, you need a subject that agrees with it in person, gender, and number. Now, as a discourse marker, vehaya or vayehi, they do not agree with a subject whatsoever. Instead, the telltale sign is that they're followed by some kind of temporal phrase. For instance, vehaya ki yir'u otach hamitzrim, vehargu oti ve'otach yachayu, where it's third person masculine singular, but there is no masculine singular subject to agree with it. In the next clause, you have this, but it's masculine plural because it agrees with this verb, masculine plural. So what is it doing? Well, the common interpretation is that it marks this, it's this discourse marker, that it's a marker of macro syntax, so big picture story. Particularly, it marks what's coming as the climax of a speech or story, where here we get the speech of Abraham. And he says, and it will be, because this is vekatal, when they, the Egyptians, see you, they will slay me, but you they will let live. Where? Two markers of being discourse, there's no subject that agrees with, instead a temporal clause. Here, this is a conditional statement, which I note here as a protasis, just a fancy term for a conditional clause, and then the then statement, the apodosis. So, when they see you, they will slay me, but let you live. Now, that's the traditional understanding of this construction, but I just finished reading a PhD dissertation by a friend of mine, Daniel Wilson, and one of his main contributions was to say that no, vehaya and vayehi, when they occur in this construction, it's not a discourse marker. It actually serves a certain syntactic function to mark what's coming as a thetic judgment. Thetic as opposed to categorical. And these are two different ways of making a statement. Categorical, this is what we're used to seeing, where you say something about an entity, where you're really making two statement acts, where you're establishing something that you're talking about, and then you say something about it. For instance, if you were asked, what's wrong with the butter? You could respond, the butter melted, where there's this entity, the butter, and then you're saying something about what the butter did. Now, categorical as opposed to thetic, where you're merely asserting the existence of a state of affairs. For instance, if you're asked, what happened? You could say, the butter melted, where you're not particularly concerned about what the butter did, but that you have this mess of butter before you. Okay, so let's apply this to Abraham. Now, I said, vehaya, it's this marker of a thetic judgment, not categorical. And so, Abraham couldn't have uttered this statement the way he did if he had been asked something like, Abraham, who is going to slay you? In that case, he would do the regular kind of categorical judgment. The Egyptians are going to slay me. Instead, it is this marker of a thetic judgment. It's as if he's been asked, Abraham, why are you so worried? And he gives the same reply that he does. When the Egyptians see Sarai, they'll slay me and spare her life. Where he's not particularly concerned about the Egyptians per se, but about this state of affairs where he ends up dead, even though Sarai would be able to stay living. And so what Daniel Wilson, the author, he says is that vehaya, it's not a discourse marker, it's this indicator of a thetic judgment, but this common interpretation of it being a discourse marker, they are right in that this construction does mark the climax of a speech or story, but because of something special about thetic judgments, not about discourse marker per se. And so the payoff with this story is, all right, Abraham is particularly concerned about the state of affairs where he ends up dead. But you're reading along in Genesis 12, and twice God has promised him, I'm going to make you great. I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I'm going to give this land, Canaan, to your offspring. You're going to be a great nation. You're going to have offspring. But right now, Abraham doesn't have a child. If Abraham truly believes these promises, nobody can touch him. And so why is it that Abraham is so concerned about the state of affairs where he ends up dead? Well, it's the whole question all throughout the Abrahamic material in Genesis is, does Abraham truly believe the offspring promise? And in some cases, we see, yes, he is believing, but in some cases like this, no, he is not believing the offspring promise. Next, indirect speech. As opposed to direct speech, where you are quoting someone, the very words that they're saying. Indirect speech, where you give the gist of what someone is saying. Our convention in English for direct speech is to use quotation marks. Indirect speech, no quotation marks. There are no quotation marks or anything like that in Hebrew, so how do you know that you're looking at indirect speech as opposed to direct speech? And the answer really is in the use of pronouns, because the use of pronoun tells you the vantage point that's being used for the words that are chosen. And in direct speech, the vantage point is the speaker himself. Okay? First, we'll look at the English examples, and then we can talk about the Hebrew a little bit. So this example is from Abraham talking to Sarai and telling her what she is supposed to tell the Egyptians. All right? So if what Sarai is supposed to tell the Egyptians is direct speech, it would look like this. All right. Abraham says, please say, quote, I am his sister, end quote. Where, if this were direct speech, these are the very words that Sarai is supposed to say. The vantage point is from her, so the I refers to Sarai, and then she talks about Abraham in the third person. I am his sister. But instead, the construction is of indirect speech. Abram gives her the gist of what she's supposed to say. Please say, you are my sister, where the you here is Sarai and the my, the vantage point, is Abram's vantage point, not Sarai, so this is indirect speech. All right, so to do this in Hebrew, if it were direct speech, it would have been written like this, Imrina achoto ani, so please say, his sister am I, but instead it's this, Imrina achoti at. Please say, my sister are you. So indirect speech is the gist of what someone is saying, and how you can tell is the vantage point, because the vantage point will remain the person who is speaking in the moment, right? The vantage point here, the my, refers to Abram, not to Sarai. So you know this is indirect speech. And finally, preposition et with attached pronouns. Now, we've seen so far that et can either be the object marker or the preposition that means with. And when it occurs before a noun, et in form is totally ambiguous between the two. It's spelled the exact same way for both words. So if it's joined to the following word with a makef, it's written as a segol. If it's not joined by a makef, then it's written as a tsere. It's written this way for both object marker and for preposition. And what your default should be if you see et is just assume that it's the object marker unless it doesn't work whatsoever. And we've seen an example where we get both in just one clause. Vayizkor Elohim et brito et Avraham, where this is an example from last week. God remembered his covenant, where the first one is object marker, what he remembered, his covenant with Abraham, where this can't be the object marker. If God remembered two things, then we would need a ve here. He remembered his covenant and he remembered Abraham. But it's not written that way. It's his covenant, something Abraham, makes sense with Abraham. All right, written that way, it's ambiguous. But if there's an attached pronoun on et, then these two words are totally distinct. Where we've seen the object marker where you have an initial O or E type vowel with an attached pronoun on the preposition takes an I type vowel. There's also another thing here where the preposition always has a dagesh chazak in the tav, but you can hear the difference, and that's, I think, the bigger difference. So me as object marker is OT, with me is ET. Second person, object marker is otcha and otach. Preposition, itcha, itach. Object marker, oto, ota. Preposition, ito, ita. And we can do this for plural as well. Otanu is the object marker. Itanu, preposition with us. In the second person plural, in the object marker, you get the E-type vowel, etchem, etchen. With the preposition, it remains the I-type vowel thoroughly. Itchem, itchen. And finally, otam, otan versus itam, itan. So if et is followed by a noun, then it's ambiguous in form, but just assume object marker unless it just can't work. But you can tell the difference in form if it has an attached pronoun. If it has an attached pronoun and it has an O or E type vowel, it's the object marker. If it has an I type vowel, then it's preposition with.